Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're plunging into, well, a really fascinating and complex period. The journey of the Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, as they worked towards joining the European Union back in the 1990s. We've gone through quite a stack of research and notes, really trying to pull out the absolute must-knows about this whole intricate process. Our mission for this deep dive is really to unpack the key steps, the big challenge they had to overcome, and also the remarkable achievements these three nations made as they pushed for full integration with the EU. What were the specific rules the EU laid down? How did the Baltics actually transform themselves to meet those demands? And what was the timeline really looking like?
Yeah, this was just a seismic period in European history. For the Baltic countries, it was so much more than just joining an economic club. It was fundamentally about cementing their independence after regaining it and, completely rebuilding their economic and political systems pretty much from the ground up. And for the EU, well, it represented this historic eastward enlargement, a huge moment in its post-Cold War identity. Understanding this journey, it really gives you a front row seat to the dynamics of national transformation and continental integration.
And you're going to hear some really intriguing details, things like the specific economic hurdles they faced, the detailed rulebook the EU presented, something's called the French list, and also how even within this Baltic group, each country sometimes moved at its own pace, faced its own unique challenges on that road to Brussels. Okay, so let's unpack this relationship. The foundation, it really started being built pretty early, right after they regained independence around 1993. We saw the EU and the three Baltic states begin to deepen their ties, first through initial trade and economic cooperation agreements. These then evolved fairly quickly into formal free trade agreements. I think those came into force January 1st, 1995.
Yes, and those agreements were absolutely crucial because they paved the way for a really significant political step, which was the formal application for full EU membership by all three Baltic states in the autumn of 1995. This wasn't just, filling out forms. It was a powerful statement of their strategic direction, their intention for full integration into those Western European structures.
That makes sense. So they applied in 95 after building those early connections. But the actual rules for joining, they were set earlier, weren't they? Back at that Copenhagen summit.
Exactly. The pivotal decisions really setting the stage for this enlargement were actually made back at the Copenhagen summit in 1993. And it wasn't just a vague idea that associated countries could maybe become members. No, it was there that the European Council explicitly defined the economic and political conditions that had to be met. The commitment was clear. Accession would happen, and I quote, as soon as an associated country could fully take on the obligations of membership by meeting those criteria.
Okay, Copenhagen sets the conditions. What happened after that, then, to turn those conditions into more of a concrete roadmap?
Well, following Copenhagen, the Essen summit in December 1994 was another really key political signal. It confirmed that, yes, the Central European countries were indeed on a path towards potential membership. And this really refocused the EU's whole accession policy and led directly to the development of what became known as the Comprehensive Pre-Accession Strategy.
Ah, right. The strategy designed to actually help them get ready. What did that involve? What were the main pillars of that strategy?
Well, this strategy was actually quite sophisticated. It was specifically tailored for the countries that had signed these initial agreements, these Europe agreements. It had several interconnected parts, all designed to guide and support their, massive transformation. First, you had the association agreements, or Europe agreements themselves. These were much more than just trade deals. They covered political dialogue, economic integration, cooperation across loads of different sectors. And a key feature was the gradual setup of asymmetric free trade areas.
Asymmetric, meaning?
Meaning the EU, as the much larger, stronger economy, opened its markets faster than the associated country did.
Ah, okay. So giving the Baltic economies a bit of breathing space, letting their industries adjust before facing full-on EU competition.
Precisely. It was designed to kind of ease that transition. Second part was the creation of a structured dialogue. Now, this wasn't just informal chats. It was a defined framework for regular joint meetings, bringing together EU and prospective member officials at the ministerial level and even heads of state and government meeting twice a year starting in 1995. This was vital for discussing shared concerns, things like foreign policy, security, justice, interior issues. But also, crucially, it was about getting the associated countries familiar with the EU's complex way of working, its decision-making, its institutions.
Kind of like an intensive EU immersion course, but at the highest political level.
Exactly. Getting them used to the club's procedures, you could say. Then, a real cornerstone of the strategy was the FAIR program. This was the EU's main financial and technical assistance tool. It was an immediate response to the deep structural challenges these countries faced, transitioning from planned economies. FAIR provided financial grants, policy advice, training. Its goal was pretty ambitious, supporting fundamental economic transformation and strengthening democratic institutions. And it wasn't just about giving money. FAIR also acted as a catalyst, helping to unlock funds from other international donors. And it invested directly, including in some infrastructure projects.
And this FAIR program, it was pretty substantial in terms of funding.
Oh, very substantial. Between 1990 and 1995, it made billions of ECU available across 11 countries in the region. The Baltics themselves were brought into FAIR relatively early, starting in 1992. In those initial years, 92 to 95, they received nearly 300 million ECU. That focused broadly on technical and financial aid, training, equipment, helping with macro stabilization, economic restructuring, that sort of thing. From 1995 onwards, the focus shifted more directly towards preparing for accession. They designed these multi-annual indicative programs, or MIPs, planning hundreds of millions more, specifically targeting things like implementing those free trade agreements and adopting the acquis communautaire.
Right, the EU rulebook.
Yeah.
And did that FAIR focus, did it differ much between Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania?
It did, slightly. It reflected their specific needs at the time. For instance, Estonia, which was maybe a bit ahead in some reforms, used FAIR perhaps more for export development and public sector management. Latvia and Lithuania, they put maybe more emphasis on private sector development, agriculture, the social sector, human resources. So while the overall goal was shared, the application was somewhat tailored. And the final key piece of this strategy was a white paper on legislation harmonization. This was absolutely essential. Associated countries needed to bring their own domestic laws in line with the vast body of EU law, what's known as the acquis communautaire.
The rule book for the single market, basically.
Oh.
All those regulations.
Right, precisely. The white paper, which was endorsed in June 1995, was this massive document. It set out all the essential internal market legislation across 23 different sectors. For the Baltics, trying to catch up after decades under a completely different system, this was just a huge task. Some of the biggest challenges were in areas like company law, making sure contracts were actually enforceable, modernizing their financial system laws, protecting intellectual property rights, setting up effective competition policies. The goal really was to harmonize these laws to create a secure, predictable environment for businesses, essentially extending the conditions of the EU's internal market eastward. So, okay, we've talked about the pre-accession strategy and the help the EU is providing, but let's zoom back to those core criteria set at Copenhagen back in '93. The European Council listed 3 fundamental requirements for membership. First, the political criterion. You had to show stable institutions guaranteeing democracy, the rule of law, human rights, and the respect and protection of minorities.
Yeah, absolutely essential foundational stuff after decades under Soviet rule.
Absolutely critical. Second was the economic criterion, proving you had a functioning market economy, one capable of handling the competitive pressures and market forces inside the EU. And third, the capacity to actually take on the obligations of membership. That included committing to the aims of political, economic, and monetary union, or EMU. And there was a fourth condition, often overlooked, which was a precondition, really. The EU itself had to have the capacity to absorb new members without messing up its own integration process.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, I think. Because while those Copenhagen criteria were the big headlines, they were still quite general, right? To make them more concrete, France apparently put forward a more detailed proposal, also discussed in Copenhagen, which became known, maybe informally, as the French list.
Yes, the French list. It provided much more specific indicators and guidelines on what the EU would actually be looking for when assessing a country's readiness. It went beyond just broad principles to list quite concrete measures.
Like what specifically? What sort of things were on that list? Give us some examples.
Okay, it included metrics like GDP per capita, used as a sort of general gauge development. It looked closely at the extent of privatization, how much of the economy was actually in private hands to measure how genuinely market-oriented it was. They wanted to see the capacity for quantifiable social protection systems, control over public debt and inflation, obviously, a handle on monetary and fiscal policy, including currency convertibility, capital movements. An efficient banking system was key. The economy's openness measured by, say, external trade as a percentage of GDP. They also assessed the capacity of the national administrations, the civil service, to actually implement laws, both their own and future EU laws. And finally, the existence of a modern functioning tax system, a fiscal system, was essential. And what's really insightful here is how much overlap there was between these specific points on the French list and the transition indicators developed by the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the EBRD. The EBRD had this rating system from 1 to 4 plus aid, tracking progress towards a market economy across various areas.
So the EU wasn't just inventing its own list. It was looking at the same kind of things the EBRD was already using to measure post-Soviet economic transition.
Exactly. It wasn't just some EU-specific checklist they dreamed up. They were leveraging tools and metrics already being used to assess market-oriented reform in the region. And if you look at the data from this period, you see how much progress the Baltics had actually made. By 1997, according to those EBRD assessments, all 3 Baltic countries were classified as being in advanced stages of transition across most indicators. This was a pretty clear contrast to many other former planned economies that were still in earlier stages. You see this progress clearly in areas like privatization, although the sources do note Latvia maybe lagged a bit behind in large-scale privatization compared to Estonia and Lithuania. The private sector share of GDP had also grown substantially, reaching around 70% in Estonia and Lithuania, and about 60% in Latvia by then.
That's incredibly rapid change in just a few years. Were there areas where they still needed significant work based on these EBRD indicators?
Oh, definitely. While they were classed as advanced overall, there were certainly areas flagged for further effort. Things like corporate management standards, achieving full price liberalization in certain sectors, strengthening competition policy that was especially noted for Lithuania, improving banking services and standards, further developing securities markets, and crucially, enhancing the judicial and administrative systems needed to actually support investment and enforce laws effectively. That was a big one.
Okay, let's look at some of the hard economic numbers then, the kind the French list pointed to. If you compare the Baltics' selected indicators to the EU average at the time, what sort of picture emerges?
Well, on one hand, GDP per capita was still significantly lower than the EU average. I mean, much lower. But that wasn't necessarily seen as the primary barrier in itself. The key economic test was having that functioning market economy and showing the capacity to generate wealth fast enough to potentially catch up over time. And the real GDP growth rates in the Baltics were picking up significantly from 1996 onwards. They were showing the kind of high growth needed, although, catching up quickly from that low base was still a huge, huge challenge.
So growth was strong, but starting from way behind. What about other indicators? FDI, inflation.
Right. Foreign direct investment, FDI, which was seen as really crucial for bringing in capital and know-how, especially given low domestic saving rates. Well, it was coming in, but it was kind of moderate and it could be quite volatile year to year. Inflation remained a persistent challenge. It was consistently and significantly higher than the EU average at the time. This was a key economic hurdle for them.
Okay, so inflation was stubbornly high. But were there areas where they were actually doing better than the EU average back then?
Surprisingly, yes, in fiscal management. Both the fiscal balance, the government budget deficit or surplus, and the public debt ratios were remarkably better than the average for the existing EU member states. That was a definite strength, a real positive. Their exchange rates were also generally stable, often pegged to a major currency like the Deutsche Mark or a basket, which was viewed favorably. And their exports were high relative to their GDP, showing quite open economies. Now, connecting this to the Maastricht criteria, those were the benchmarks for eventually joining the Eurozone, the EMU. The fiscal picture, low debt, low deficit, certainly aligned very well with the Maastricht requirements. That was a big plus. The pegged exchange rates were also seen as helpful for meeting the exchange rate stability criterion eventually.
But meeting the full set of Maastricht criteria was still a pretty big challenge for them at that stage.
Oh, absolutely. Inflation was the major one, as we said. It needed to fall dramatically to get anywhere near the EU average required for Maastricht. And there was a more structural issue, too. Assessing the interest rate criterion, one of the Maastricht tests required developed long-term capital markets, like a functioning market for 10-year government bonds. These markets simply didn't exist or were very, very rudimentary in the Baltics at that point. So meeting that criterion wasn't just hard. It was basically impossible until the prerequisite financial markets were actually developed first.
This really raises an important question, doesn't it? For countries going through such incredibly rapid fundamental transformation, from planned economies, How do you possibly balance the urgent need to meet these specific, often quantifiable EU criteria right now with the much longer, deeper process of building market institutions, developing financial markets, achieving sustainable macroeconomic stability? It sounds like juggling an awful lot of balls at once. So with all these criteria, these challenges, what did it actually mean for that timeline? When could the Baltics realistically expect to join the EU?
Well, the Baltic countries themselves, they were pushing hard for individual timetables based on their own progress. They really emphasized a merit-based approach. The EU, however, was initially quite reluctant to give really firm guarantees at this stage. They felt it was maybe premature, given the sheer scale of the transformation that was still needed. A major process that would influence the timing was the Intergovernmental Conference, the IGC, which started in March 1996. This was where the existing EU member states were discussing their own internal reforms needed to prepare for enlargement. So EU readiness was also a factor. The concrete outcome regarding the timeline really came from the European Commission's big Agenda 2000 package that was presented in June 1997, and the final decision was endorsed at the Luxembourg summit in December 1997.
Okay, so what was decided there? Who was in, who was maybe later?
The Commission recommended a first wave of 6 countries to open full accession negotiations. That was the Czech Republic, Estonia, Hungary, Poland, Slovenia, plus Cyprus. Full talks with these 6 were set to start in April 1998, but importantly, preparatory talks were announced to begin simultaneously March 30th, 1998, with the remaining 11 applicant countries. And that group included Bulgaria, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, and Slovakia. All 11 of those were offered reinforced pre-accession partnerships to intensify their preparations.
So Estonia made it into that first group for negotiations, but Latvia and Lithuania were in the second group, starting preparatory talks.
That's right. The decision was differentiated based on perceived readiness at that moment. And even for that first wave, actual membership wasn't anticipated until 2002 at the very earliest. Realistically, people were looking more towards 2004 or 2005. For Latvia and Lithuania in the second group, their timeline depended entirely on their speed of reform and, of course, the EU's own capacity and willingness to absorb that second wave later on. And just think about the sheer scale of the legislative work involved, aligning thousands and thousands of pages of EU law. Sources note, for example, Latvia needed to align something like 400 directives just by the end of 1999. Estonia was targeting around 1,000 pieces of legislation by mid-1997. This was just an enormous administrative undertaking. It required huge human resources and really strained their still developing government capacities.
And beyond the pure economics and the legislation, there were other factors at play too, right? Geopolitics must have been a huge driver, bringing these countries firmly back into the Western fold after decades of Soviet control.
Oh, absolutely. While economic and legal criteria were paramount on paper, the underlying geopolitical drive was undeniable for both sides. The desire to anchor these countries firmly within the EU's zone of stability and prosperity was a really powerful motivator. But yes, from a purely practical standpoint, the administrative burden of adopting the Acquis Communautaire was just immense. It wasn't just about translating laws, it was about creating the institutions, training the people, building the enforcement capacity to actually make those laws work on the ground.
And what about their relationship with other international bodies like the IMF during this time? Were they still involved alongside the whole EU process?
Yes, that's another interesting layer. Despite having this clear path and support structure towards EU accession, both Estonia and Latvia actually found it beneficial to maintain programs with the IMF during this period. The IMF provided, valuable policy advice and access to financing, which could be important for maintaining macroeconomic stability through this turbulent transition. Lithuania, for instance, apparently didn't plan another IMF program after 1997. It's also worth noting that while they were generally aligned on the broad goals of market reform, advice from the IMF, say, on lowering tariffs rapidly could sometimes differ slightly from the advice given by the EU, especially in the context of preparing for those detailed accession negotiations later.
So they were kind of navigating guidance from multiple international bodies, all while trying to hit these very specific EU targets. That just adds another layer of complexity to it all. Wow. Okay, looking back, it's just so clear this is a period of absolutely immense transformation and incredibly intricate negotiation for Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. They essentially had to rebuild their countries from the inside out while simultaneously preparing to join one of the world's most integrated economic and political blocs. They made such significant progress on economic and legal reforms, really driven and helped along by that comprehensive EU pre-accession strategy we talked about.
Absolutely. And while they did demonstrate some notable economic strengths relatively early on, particularly in areas like fiscal management and exchange rate stability, where they were actually performing better than the EU average in some cases, significant work definitely remained. Harmonizing thousands of complex laws across dozens of sectors, developing those crucial long-term financial markets from scratch, and bringing inflation under control, these were still major challenges they faced to meet all the criteria, including those pointing towards eventual participation in the euro.
So what does understanding this deep dive into the Baltics journey really mean for you, listening? Well, it highlights the truly multifaceted nature of integrating economies and political systems. It shows that it's not just about signing treaties or hitting a few economic numbers. It requires fundamental internal change, building institutions, changing laws, developing human capital, all while receiving significant external support. And, as we just heard, navigating sometimes competing advice.
And this raises a really important question, I think. For any country undergoing such profound and rapid transformation with the goal of integration, how do they effectively prioritize the vast array of necessary reforms? How do you sequence those changes? How do you allocate your often very limited resources, financial, human, to achieve success across so many different fronts simultaneously? It's a challenge with relevance far beyond just this historical example. You see echoes of it in transformation efforts around the world today.
A truly challenging puzzle to ponder indeed. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.